All right, thank you for joining us again, and thank you for sitting in the front row, following instructions. Tonight we're going to be talking about observability. Last quarter, if you weren't here, we were doing one on deployments, getting stuff in production, and it was well received. The format of this is we're just going to ask questions, and if you also have questions, also ask questions yourself. Literally just raise your hand as we go. But tonight we got Justin, Damian, and Ben.
Not in that order.
Yeah,
No,
okay,
no,
order.
Change,
But if you each want to go and just introduce yourself, where you're currently working, what are you currently doing, go from there.
Okay. Hi everyone, I am Ben. I currently work at IC Plant as a engineering manager. Also do a bit of platform work. Previously, I've worked many roles, from working in places with a single non-redundant server on-prem through to massive complex distributed systems in AWS. At the moment, IC Plant, we're 100% serverless in AWS, running Laravel, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you. I'm Damian. That's enough. I do it. No, I don't actually. I don't have a job. I am a freelance CTO consultant, so I work across a number of sort of smaller businesses. I sort of like the 30 to 50 person size company that sort of doesn't have a CTO or somebody in that sort of really senior leadership role. So I like to work across that. I've done, over the last 2 and a bit decades, bunch of stuff. I've done a couple of really terrible startups. I've done a lot of consulting, and now I'm sort of combining terrible startups and consulting together. I also have launched a business doing software development training and architecture training around particularly microservices. So tend to talk about this stuff, fix this stuff. Again, with the sort of CTO consulting, I tend to walk into a lot of companies that are on fire. I'm sicko. I like that sort of thing. So unfiring things.
Justin Hennessy, I'm currently the CTO of Outfit, about to be the CTO of Redline next couple of weeks, which is pretty cool. So I've been in the sort of the infrastructure space for 25 years. Went through the normal infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and then into cloud. And, Ben and I have actually had the privilege of working together on a very, very large scale e-commerce platform called Nito, which none of the business in that name. Yeah, observability is pretty close to my heart. It's something that I've sort of grown up with through my career. So yeah, it's something I'm pretty passionate about.
Excellent. That's very loud click, isn't it? The first question is then, what do you think of when you think of observability, like around partly a definition, but also, yeah, just what do you think of observability? You got the mic, you know, at the start with the first.
To me, well, I mean, the sort of the definition of observability is really being able to ascertain the health of a system by observing the outside and then tracing on the inside. It's a natural evolution of where monitoring has come from. In the old days, there was static infrastructure. You monitored all the servers. You knew sort of each one. You named them all like pets, and you have themes and comic book heroes, things like that.
Futurama characters.
That's it.
Looney Tunes characters.
That's it. And as we grew up in that space and got into cloud and everything became dynamic, obviously you can't do that anymore. So then you Bill Baker, who was a Microsoft engineer, came up with the pets versus cattle thing, which then Amazon sort of ran with. You started treating infrastructure like a herd of servers rather than just individual. So for me, observability is really about watching the outside events to tell you what the health of the inside is.
How does observability then play in with metrics and logging and all the other things that we might talk about?
So I was just going to add to Justin's comment. Observability is one of those words that we as an industry love to take and completely throw out all the meaning of and DevOps, like DevOps, right? It's like somebody there's a term, it has a meaning, everyone wants to jump on the bandwagon, and sort of, the meaning is completely thrown out. So yes, observability becomes, depending on which vendor you ask, all of those things. So yeah, I mean, and I don't think enough people, when they talk about it, kind of look back to Honeycomb, who I think Charity Majors pretty much coined the term, and then every vendor went, we're going to stomp on that and completely derail the meaning of it. What was your question?
How does observability differ to just like logging and monitoring?
Yeah.
How do they relate?
So I think, to me, like, observability is sort of become a bit of an umbrella term for all of that. To me, it's like, how do we determine the health of a system, particularly in a world of distributed systems, whether it's microservices or functions as a service? We don't have, is it up or down anymore? It's, to what degree is the health of our system compromised? So all of it comes into that. You've got your sort of external things, you've got internal tracing, you've got logging. Structured logging is a massive thing for me, to be able to sort of understand how is the overall health of the system, because it's not a binary thing anymore. You probably have, yeah. I do.
Well, I was going to echo a lot of it. It's an umbrella term.
Yeah.
It is alerting, alarming, and monitoring metrics and logging. Like, it's all of these things all in one. You can't really have a good understanding of the health of the system without all those things together, right? And if something is hurting, you need to be able to point to one thing and say, yeah, that's where it's hurting, and then actually go deeper and dive in as into your logs or into your metrics to understand exactly where the hurt is coming from. So to me, it is an umbrella term of all these things together. Yeah.
So let's just say, hypothetically, asking for a friend, you let's just say you were.
You're a plucky startup doing
But it's currently hiring a senior engineer.
I hear that.
Let's say hypothetically you had like a basic EC2 sort of set of servers and basic RDS or some sort of relational database or thing, and you're starting to scale and things are starting to go wrong. Like, where do you start with going down this avenue? Like, do you just go to the Datadog salesperson and say, I would like one Datadog? Does that solve everything?
If you've got the money, sure.
Like any good question, the answer is
It depends.
And drinks.
So I find the biggest limiter in these things is generally cost. So yeah, if you went to the Datadog vendor, they'll probably take you out to dinner, they'll buy you some drinks, and then they'll bend you over because they will cost a fortune. And so, generally speaking, if you are a large enterprise, then yeah, Datadog is absolutely the right way to go. Or Honeycomb's mentioned, that's also very expensive, but a very, very good product. But if you're working for a small business and you're just starting out, you're starting to scale, and you're in AWS, for example, CloudWatch is a perfectly feasible solution. That CloudWatch will give you most of the tools you need to get the job done. There's no reason to go to Datadog and bend over for.
Charming analogies aside. Can I plug someone?
Yeah.
Can I plug? There's a Brisbane company called Datalust who have a product called Seek. I don't know if anyone's heard of Seek or Datalust. I know you have, Andy. So it's kind of very well known in the .NET space because the founder, sort of fairly well known, has done a lot of open source work. It is a sort of self-hosted solution that is kind of very economical. It's about $1,000 a license. The big thing it gives you, and I think the big thing that a lot of this, and New Relic will do this as well, and depending on the size, New Relic can be free. Is structured logging. You can get a long way with structured logging. So
Tell us what structured logging
well, I'm
is.
glad you asked, Tom. So, traditionally our logs were, you would spit out a line of text. You might have some string interpolation in your code, just spit a line of text into a text file, and you would roll them over every, 7 days or something and never read them until something went wrong. And then you realize that the thing that went wrong was 8 days ago and you don't have that log file anymore. Or if you kind of break into microservices, now you've got 10 servers, now you're grepping log files across 10 servers trying to find the thing, and it's impossible. So structured logging is about storing not just the log message, but properties attached to it. So once you've got that, and you can aggregate them into the sort of database that lets you search on those properties, all of a sudden you can build a really good picture of your log space properties. So then you can add stuff like a transaction ID or a web request ID or a user ID or a client ID, attach those as properties to the log, and then you can search it out. So like we've all had that, something went wrong. What were they doing when it went wrong? We don't know. You know, you can track what was that user doing, what pages were they hitting, what parts of your system were they hitting, because every log message is tagged with that user ID, or what charity managers call the high cardinality ID. So you can then go, show me all of the logs for this user, or if there was an error in a particular request, what was the ID of that request? Show me all the logs for that request. You start to pull it all together just through the fact that your logs are no longer a line of text. There are essentially a JSON document with properties attached to them. That's what social logging is.
That's good.
Yeah, like I think the important thing to note is that there's a pretty natural progression when you start how you structure things. You know, you don't need a lot of tooling. Like, if you do things in the right way, so a really common pattern, particularly if you're going sort of to the original intent of observability, and that's around being able to trace things from the source to the origin. You know, using things like correlation ID or trace IDs through your request, so that you can actually go, okay, well, this request came in on the outside, had this unique ID, it hit the database, and I can see that through the platform. You don't need any tooling for that. It's actually just design. It's actually a well-designed application. Centralized logging becomes a massive thing once you start to break into services. To be able to understand, the traversal of requests across those things, and then microservices as another massive leap, and that's where very sophisticated service meshes and things like that. But there's actually really logical progression and growth in tooling, the way that you architect things to do observability well.
I do have something to add.
Yes.
Please do it.
Sorry for the terrible analogies earlier, but no,
We're done with that. We're moving on.
moving on. So a lot of, I kind of, logging is not something I generally use for distributed systems. If you're just running a single EC2 instance and that's all you need, then that's fine. And logging will be a huge help. But generally speaking, I don't actually look at logs. Mainly what I'm looking at is metrics. And when you're starting to scale, things are going to start breaking, especially your database. Generally, your database or your cache layer are generally the things that are going to fall over at scale. So emergent design really comes into play here. So when things start breaking, you run a post-mortem, you figure out what broke, you figure out what metrics, sort of predated that breakage, and then you start creating alerts, you start creating graphs with those metrics on them. And over time, you will find you are creating very good dashboards, you're creating very good alerts, so that you can actually detect these breakages before they actually happen. So that's probably my one best tip for a company that is scaling up, is take note of the things that break, how they break, and then graph them and alert on them.
Is it something that's reasonable to be able to do in advance of it breaking? Or is it really just
I mean, if you have the knowledge, then yeah, absolutely. You can come in and create all these alerts and things before they happen. But generally speaking, with every distributed system is going to be different. Every complex system is going to be completely different from the other. I mean, yes, your databases are generally, like I said, is where it's going to hurt most. So you can, graph your select latency, for example. That's a really good example of something that you should be alerting on. And once it reaches a certain point, like say, for example, if you're in AWS, use Aurora, 200 milliseconds is where you want to alert. If your select latency is above 200 milliseconds, that's generally a bad place to be. But yeah, generally speaking, it's something that will just come out of your your post-mortems as you go along.
The question I had written down was, how does metrics, to the same extent like logging, I guess, as well, feed into new design or new features going forward? Like, how much can you actually reasonably predict is going to happen? And then does that piece of like, we're building this and we can think of the risks of how it might go wrong, how much does that sort of defensibility around how can we then monitor that in production? Is that reasonable to add into the dev process, or is it something that really comes out after you've been with the problem?
Yeah, like I think the one of the things that we learned early on is the health of a service is actually very subjective, and understanding and defining what a healthy service looks like is very important. I think that's where teams get stuck, is that they actually retrofit the metrics after trying to go, oh, well, now we think it's healthy. Whereas when you're building it, you want to be very mindful about, these three metrics are, if these go red, the service is in big trouble. So I think the proactiveness is actually being very deliberate about the metrics that you define of every service as to what healthy is.
Can I disagree with both of you?
Go, please.
Excellent. Andy just came here to watch me disagree with people. So, because I do agree with that, but I've also seen the opposite true, particularly in bigger companies in enterprise. They're like, right, we are going to put in some logging and application dynamic monitoring, and you'll have a 6-month project to plan out every metric and every dashboard. It's like, you have no idea what you're doing in production right now. So like, how are you going to plan that out? So there is that sort of element of emergent design, but I have seen people go way too far the other way. Just go, right, we're going to do a 6-month project of designing all the dashboards for the entire organization. What do we need? Go. This is doomed from the beginning. And I may have said that. On the other side, logs, I sort of tend to go the other way. I can go a long way with good structured logging if you add that in the beginning at that sort of very surface layer of just like what APIs are getting hit, what pages are going to get hit, and then be able to trace that, like tag every log event that happens throughout my system, and you sort of put some logging stuff in core pieces like in your data layer or whatever. They'll get correlated with the request. For very little investment, you can evolve your monitoring, because you do have those events and they're sort of tagged with those request IDs and whatever else. And you can start to go, something's feeling a little bit funny. Let's do a query of the elapsed millisecond for every request that came into this API. Stick that on the dashboard.
You can just do that with tracing without the data overhead of logging though.
Sure. But the logs come in useful. Like once you've got the trace and you go, oh, that looks funny, you've got it there to be able to dig into like what happened in that. Like, yes, our error rate just went up. Let's pick one and let's now drill down into it and have a look. So, and it depends on the tooling as well. But some of the stuff that I'm doing, I'll start with structured logging and then I can drill in as needed, then go, I don't have enough visibility of a certain part of that. Let's go add some more.
Okay. I think where we've found value out of structured logging is that you've gotten stuff blowing up in production and you want to get as close as you can as you can get to essentially your dev machine of like the error log just spit out on my computer. You want to get as close to that as you can.
Yeah, if your dev experience is the same as your production experience, then yeah, you know how to behave.
Works backwards.
And also, sorry, it sort of becomes that. And this is where like actual DevOps works really well. If you bring sort of operations and development closer, your development team starts to understand, because I find a lot of developers don't understand like what to log and when, at what level, and how to do it. And so if you're using the same tooling in dev and production, then or if the developers are doing local debugging with the same sort of tooling you're using in production, then you're probably going to end up with better quality logging.
Makes sense.
Where do you start with logging and metrics? Like, what are the first things that if you went into a system and didn't have any of those things, what are the first like 3 things that you would add?
The question is, where do you start?
Where do you start? So for me, like if a lot of the stack I work in, by installing the logging component and attaching it to the web stack, I get, here are the web requests, here's a trace ID, here's an elapsed time. That's a start. And then being able to tag anything that happens in the context of that request with that, just out of the box, I at least know which of my slow pages or which of my slow API calls.
I just want to say that I think you're right about logging. It's just I've had very bad experiences in that the application either has no logging or has logging that is completely useless and is extremely verbose. So yeah, there's definitely a point to be made there. Where do you start? Centralized logging, very important. Have them. If you have disparate systems, making sure the logs are all in one place so they're easy to query, easy to grab. In terms of metrics, it depends where you are. If you're in AWS, and I'm very biased towards AWS, so I'm sorry if I'm talking about things like CloudWatch, but that's what I use. Yeah, it's a matter of having a dashboard for one thing and one thing only to start with. where it hurts, So things like I mentioned earlier, you can find these. Actually, Datadog is a really good resource, by the way. As expensive as they are, they actually have really good resources around what metrics should you track for any given thing, whether that's databases, Redis, etc. They will tell you what metrics are important. So read through that, take the top 3, and just create a dashboard, like an overarching, what I call a customer experience dashboard. Which is essentially a a traffic light dashboard of those important metrics, those top 3 metrics for any given upstream service of what you use. I cannot stress enough how good a resource Datadog is for that. I commonly refer to them when I'm creating dashboards myself. Tracing I can't talk about because I haven't worked with microservices much, so Damian probably did, but better person to talk about those things. And alerting, like have something simple. If you are already in the Atlassian ecosystem, you can probably use Opportunity for free. And yeah, so think about those top metrics, and where the light goes red, think about what those things are, what numbers they are, and then create alerts into Opportunity and hook it up to your phone. So you get woken up. The worst thing is to wake up in the morning and realize the website's been down all night, right? So there's very cheap services you can utilize for these kinds of things. There's no excuse not to use them, especially when they're like Opportunity. It's almost completely free if you're already in that ecosystem. Yeah.
Andy, would you like to speak?
No,
Atlassian production further?
no, I really would. I did meet them like 2 weeks ago, but no, I wouldn't say thank you.
PagerDuty's free for 5 years.
Yeah, I also came from PagerDuty prior to this.
I love PagerDuty, but
I actually had a question. You guys have all spoken about no logs or too many logs or not the right logs. What are the right logs? I know someone other than Damian. I know his answer.
So again, like this is a PHP meetup, and I don't know much about PHP. Like cards on the table. I'm in the wrong room. But for me, it's kind of find some logging library or framework that gives you some basic edge monitoring for free. Like I think that sort of observability of like what does it look like from the edge. If you can plug something in at the sort of infrastructure level that gives you this HTTP response returns this code in this time, just out of the box, and then tag anything that happens in that context, that's your start. Because like straight out of the box, you go, what are my slow API calls? And then working from there. But that's what I start with. I go, how many requests am I doing and how quickly are they going? What are the outliers? And then dig into the outliers.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. I think starting with the outside of the onion and working their way in is a good way to start. And just extension on what Ben said, I think it's also good to be looking at metrics that are important, not just technical metrics, but metrics that are important to the business. So if they're revenue impacting, or if they're whatever, they're the really important ones around. If you're taking payments, or you're taking orders, or whatever, having high level metrics around the success measures for the business.
Which you can get out of structured log.
Seek does some great dashboards.
Seek does some great dashboards.
And Damian and checkout for 20%. I mean, to that end as well, where does the visibility in terms of our logging, monitoring, metrics and stuff, where does that go across the team? Who can actually access that, and where have you seen it work well and bad in the past? Is that the CEO and the janitor should be able to equally access all this information, or a secret gilded elite technical crew access it and somewhere in between?
So I think this is actually another depends question, because obviously when you're a startup, everyone has access to everything. I think as you scale, it's a good idea to continue that availability, but it also depends on what vertical. So if you're in heavily regulated or compliant spaces, that becomes really hard. So if you're going for PCI DSS, or you're going through ISO, they're very, very big on separation of functional control. If you've got a really good auditor and you can spin a really good narrative, you can get it to a good place. But at the end of the day, it's really about, and it falls into the DevOps function, right? You want everyone to have an appreciation of the whole life cycle. One of the things I tout a lot is, developers need to blur the line between infrastructure and development. You have to understand what you're actually doing and the impact it's going to have on the infrastructure, because you can't just throw it over the wall to the operations team and just forget about it.
I have another take on that too. So certainly you can do some of that stuff with, Relic or an App Dynamic. You can build dashboards, and the dashboards are locked down with permission so that you can have, the CEO looking at the takings for the day. I tend to have another approach for some of that stuff. I work a lot. When I do microservices, they tend to be very messaging based, like event-driven architectures, message bus type stuff. With that, you tend to have sort of semantic events flying around your system in a sort of pub sub environment. And one of them might be, we just completed a sale. That sale had a dollar figure attached to it. So I tend to, in most big systems, again, emergent design, they tend to evolve some system that captures those key business events and stores it in a database. And then you can build like a custom operational dashboard that's like, here are the failures. Because sometimes you might have some transaction that fails and needs to be retried or rerun or reprocessed or looked at for some other way. Essentially your support team are looking at. So your support team are not going to dive into your logs and go, it's so-and-so's order failed, we need to ring them. Or capturing sales totals, and you sort of build that into your app, like kind of capture those events, stick them in a database, and actually build that into your app. So you can have something that somebody can log into a page on your app, and there's a dashboard of what your sales are. And again, in the systems I like to work in, which are sort of very event-driven, message-based systems, it's easy to go, oh, I care about that business event and that business event and that business event, and then build something custom to catch it.
You're not getting off easy, man. The question I have for you, the question I have for you is there anything unique, weird, different about doing Lambda functions and running a serverless environment that is quite different to EC2 standard sort of setups there?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you're running PHP and EC2, you've dealt with APM workers most of the time, right? Now I've got advice if you are doing that, but in a serverless environment, you just don't need to care about that. Literally, all you need to care about is, do I have enough memory? Most times, yes. When you're in Lambda, for example, AWS Lambda, your memory will define the amount of CPU, and you want that to be pretty high, right? PHP tends to be more, depending on the app, it tends to be more CPU bound. So you're generally going to have more memory than you need. But there's still an important thing to track. And you need to look at concurrency. You need to look at cold starts. Off the top of my head, I think that's pretty much it. Like PHP and Lambda is so worry-free. It is like, I can sleep at night.
Yeah, what even
I can sleep at night. It's amazing.
Without getting too into the weeds here, what is a Lambda function in an environment? Does that marry up with like a controller in a Laravel or a Symfony environment? Is that what a function is to you?
If you're a purist, it is a controller action.
And a pragmatist?
And if you are a realist,
Yeah.
and you're using something like Laravel Vapor, it's pretty much an entire application in a single Lambda function. But you can still break that up into smaller services. But I used to be on the purist side of things. I even wrote a PHP library that allowed you to run pure PHP in Lambda.
Oh, that sounds like a talk.
It was a talk, Tom.
You'll find it on our archives on YouTube.
Yeah, so sorry, I completely lost my train of thought now.
I think that was his point.
Sorry, you are.
Yes, check it out on YouTube. It's a great
Like
talk.
and subscribe.
The guy really knew what he was talking about.
So in that example though, like you're saying like you guys probably more lean towards the run the whole app in a Lambda function sort of thing.
Exactly right. It's just we call it macro services. I know it's
Brand that.
Trademark.
Good work.
I can make a fortune on the conferences. Now, yeah, so essentially we break it down into smaller services, but any given service might have 10, 20, 30, 100 endpoints running in a single Lambda function. And that's completely fine.
It doesn't really change anything.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. And Vapor makes things, Vapor manages the infrastructure for you. And it does have its own monitoring. It's kind of okay, I guess, but we don't use it. No, 100% CloudWatch is and MSG to monitor, to alert. So,
Damian,
Yes.
what clusterfucks have you seen? What's the worst setup you've seen? And what's the you start with that first. Do you want to pause the recording here?
No, I'm just trying to think what's not under NDA anymore.
Were you looking for another talk?
Yeah, this is my whole career, Tom. So there was one. How widely does this talk go? This is recording go.
It's recorded.
Worldwide.
It'll go on
It's
YouTube.
Yeah.
I can blur it out if you.
No, it's all good.
Yeah.
So
Redacted.
I'm going to say retail delivery fast food, a chain that no longer exists. And this was great. So a company, and this is like a lot of what I look at around the place is company legacy system. It's working. It's worked. You know, it's built a business around it. Has some warts. They've sort of neglected it. They go, let's rebuild it from scratch. What could possibly go wrong? And they go out and find one of the cheapest vendors who makes the biggest promise and go, you'll do. This vendor said Microsoft Commerce Server is an excellent solution. Now, you know the pain? Yeah. Microsoft Commerce Server was a sort of piece of middleware that Microsoft acquired back in the, early mid-2000s. And it was like, yeah, if you want to sell books, you can have your catalog here and we'll sort of handle the transaction pipeline. And wasn't designed for customizing the sorts of fast food that you could just put lots of different toppings on and comes in deals and is cheaper on one particular night of the week. We might have eaten some tonight, I don't know. And you could tell it was one of those, do you ever do code archaeology where you look through it and go, yes, I can see the degrees of panic that the developers were getting into. You could tell the early code in there because they're like, we're going to do domain-driven design here. And this is like, when a customer orders a food on a Tuesday night, then the price is a bit cheap because it's cheap Tuesday. And by the end of it, it's just like public void manage. So you could tell when the panic rot set into this code base, and it just didn't work. Stuff would just blow up and just like handle the error, keep going. But like the error was, okay, we've taken the order, we've charged the money, but the email didn't send, blow up. I don't know, but we ordered, I don't know. Or the stores, the franchisees would unplug their modem because they didn't want to like drive any more deliveries that night. Did it work? I don't know. So lots of things went wrong. And so the observability in that environment when we got in there, and orders were going to like wrong stores, like it was terrible. You would say, deliver this to me, and the store would get it as a pickup order because something, just terrible stuff, right? It's the first system where I've worked on where one of the symptoms was people were coming into the store and wanting to punch people. Because violence was involved. Anyway, the observability in that system was the next morning when somebody was trying to punch on with the staff at the store, the manager would ring head office and go, I've got 47 orders that were for a different store and they've turned up on my printer on the wrong day and customers are screaming at me. That was the observability. That was probably the best one. Is that what you wanted? War
I was
story?
looking for the worst, but I think that is the
Well,
worst.
it's best and worst, But yeah, that one was just like there was nothing, and that's where like a lot of the let's get some messages in here to go. Like we know when something starts to fail and why it starts to fail, so that we could grow. Like the first day that we went live with the rescue of the system, the first thing that went fail because one of the stores didn't have the product that was on the website, and it started blowing up. We're like, I could see it was failing before the customer knew it was failing. And before their order had said, look, we failed to place this order because the store was rejecting it, I was on the phone going, I've just seen your order for these 7 items of food. First day of new system, there's a bug. I can see your order. This is what you want. I'll make sure they get it. And I rang the store because I had this kind of, I'm not going to say real time because real time is a lie. But I could see as failures were happening, they were surfacing up in the tooling that we built. And I was like literally on the phone going, this order just came through, make sure it happens. So yeah, that kind of went from the next day, the store owner and the customer very, very unhappy to, I'm on the phone before you even know that it's broken. So,
How long did you spend on the phone that day?
not long actually. Like there was that first one, and we were able to ship fixes pretty quickly. But it was just there was a mapping of the product codes on the website and the product codes in the store. And again, stores were unplugging their modems at night, so they didn't have to do delivery, so they weren't getting like catalog updates. A lot of stuff came out of that.
Sorry. Justin, outfit is Rails.
Yes.
Yes. Did you obviously worked in some PHP backgrounds before? Did you learn anything fun or interesting working in Rails? This is now just a retrospective about your time at Outfit, but also just from like running things in production as well. I feel like many of us may have spun up the old Rails application, but maybe not so many actually running in prod.
It's actually a very difficult comparison because the scale is so much different. Neato was a $1 billion e-commerce platform. Outfit is not a $1 billion platform. So look, I think scale has a lot to do with it. Look, I think that the general patterns of how teams are regards to the technology, I think if they're doing things in the right way, the outcome is going to be relatively good. The Rails community is obsessive about testing, so that's something that's I think been baked in from the beginning of time. So that was something that we worked on very heavily at Neato, because in the beginning that wasn't the case. There wasn't a lot of good attitudes around testing, and people didn't really understand the benefit of testing and trying to educate.
Nathan does.
He's got the best t-shirt. And the bigger problem is educating a business into why our developers spend half of their time writing tests when they could be doing these other features. So so I think the culture around testing in Rails traditionally has been much stronger. But I think a lot of organisations struggle with that regardless of technology. So no, I don't think there's too many differences. The way the way you sort of package things up and the way you deploy things is very similar. So I think there's a lot of common patterns in sort of all of that whole software development lifecycle. So nothing really stands out.
Anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Sam? Gotta raise your hand.
How deep do you chase the rabbit hole of making sure your observability tools are up and healthy?
So who watches the watcher? Is that what you mean?
Effectively, just personal experience, things like you're logging to a file, but the disk runs out of space, so your logs stop happening. So, or the thing that you've got monitoring the logs falls over, and that you've got nothing to tell you that it fell over.
I've never had.
Yeah, you go,
Yeah.
because it's a good question. It's a very
Yeah, I mean, your question of if you're logging to files and run out of disk space, definitely had that. Moving to sort of more modern tooling, whether they're, sort of a Datadog or a New Relic, which is kind of SaaS, you're paying for it to be someone else's problem. I've not had that issue really with modern tooling, that it's been an issue. Something that Andy has a comment. Something that I have seen.
Datadog and PagerDuty are both hosted in US West too.
Yeah, right.
The test region.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it does happen.
Yeah, I mean, it does happen. I've not seen it be a problem. What I have seen is, one of the things is applications that crash just kind of get torn down and they stop logging. So the absence of logging is an event in itself. So putting some alerts on, I should have seen this by now, is one thing that I'll do it. So it's less about the logging tooling, because sort of modern tooling, centralized tooling, you're worrying less about my server ran out of disk space.
So on that, are you saying you implement a bit of a dead man switch? Or
Yeah, most logging tools that will let you do alerts will say, if I haven't seen this event in X period of time, that's an event in itself, and then you can raise something on that. You've got something to add to that?
DMS, dead man switch.
Yeah.
Perfect idea.
Yeah, I was going to say, going back to your original point, I think logging in particular, centralized logging is a no-brainer. So, you shouldn't be worrying about whether or not your servers are filling up. Like, again, it's the whole pets and cattle thing. So.
Should also have metrics on disk usage.
That's
I'll give you a specific example that we had, which was our credentials for a ECS container to be able to send logs to CloudWatch is expiring after 6 hours. So just miraculously every day at midday, they'll just be able to stop and logs. And that ended up, the way we started finding it originally was we're trying to troubleshoot things and couldn't find logs for request IDs coming through elsewhere. So like, that's weird. But then now, having invested more through CloudWatch Insights, and then bring that to Grafana, it's a pretty easy view of like, you can see every day looks like this, where you're sort of a 9 to 5.
Visualizing
house,
logs tells so much of a story, right?
especially when it just stops.
When it stops. So it's
It's
like, yeah,
really-
nothing,
Yeah.
like nothing. Like,
And anecdotally as well, it's also really easy to get pretty easy business buy-in as well. If you can show a thing that does this,
Yeah.
like, we're going to make it do that instead of this.
So see this bit, it needs to be up there. That's
Yeah.
going to cost you this much money.
We get it. Yeah. Jimbo?
Yeah, separation between observability and APM tools, like where we want to work out exactly which queries are slow, and because like our system, like we can make in some requests, I know it sounds awful, but it's just the nature of it, is, you know, hundreds of SQL requests in a given query to generate a couple of lines on a report or something like that. We don't have an APM tool in place. We have more logs and bug snag sort of catching errors.
Yeah.
So APM tools, like where's the barrier there between just really good logging and then a full on, like, I want to know exactly what happened during this request?
Yeah, well, this is why Datadog is making the money, right? So,
And New Relic too.
and
New Relic,
New Relic and, you know, all those. So I was actually talking about this before. Like, once you get beyond the, let's call it the standard monitoring and the standard metrics, and you want to start branching into APM, to things like synthetics, which is sort of APM endpoint testing, seams, when you go down the compliance path, that's when you start to need to have think about, well, you know, what do I want my tooling to look like? Do I actually want a consolidated lens to look through? You know, and that's where you know, all of these really high-end vendors are starting to win that space, because they are, you know, they're getting a huge amount of breadth, you know, a log ingestion, you know, all that kind of stuff. And you know, people like Sumo Logic and, you know, those companies, that's why they're really emerging as sort of these really strong players, because they're starting to bring together all of the components that you need as you grow as you scale as a business. As a startup, you don't need it. You just do with what you have. But as you get bigger and bigger and it becomes more complex and you have to bring in governance layers and compliance and things like that, that's where these more pricey tools come into it. And that's where you start picking a vendor and you go, actually, like Ben said, you know, Datadog is very appropriate for very, very large businesses, because you can get a central lens across thousands and thousands of people, services, and without too much overhead.
Sort of, I guess, on to what extent are you looking at extending observability into what's actually running on client devices or all running web applications? We found that the performance of the endpoint, that's an easy win, right? Optimize the hell out of your endpoint, throw more memory at it, bigger databases, make it respond faster. And then the React component hits some slow Android device and it wants like a button. To what extent does the things like real user monitoring actually fall into them?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, again, the sort of big APM vendors, that's, you know, they do give that end to end. So you install their library, they will inspect what's happening on the client, you know, it's a browser or a mobile plugin or whatever. And then sort of, you know, we're talking about tracing a request from your API endpoint through your code, but they'll expand it either side. So from the time you push the button on your React component to what the browser's doing, to the request, to the server, all the way down to the database, that kind of covers that whole thing. And that's where you start to really pay some money, because then you can see what the user experience is, like even more than just like what's my code doing. But yeah, it costs.
Actually, can I just add to that before you go? Sorry, I was just going to say, this is actually a really good point around architecture, application architecture. So when you make a decision to go down the microservices path or the Lambda path, you know, the purest Lambda path or the decoupled front end from back end, these are the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about. So, you know, you bring in that complexity of, you know, with microservices, you bring the network layer. So suddenly you not only have to worry about your APM running in your application, but you've got to worry about network latency, and you've got to worry about a lot of this stuff. So having a really good sort of philosophy around how you architect the application is really important too, because those decisions start to determine the tooling that you need and the kind of visibility and observability you need, and that gets more and more complicated as it gets more and more fractured and more in scale.
So I was just going to add one little thing there because I love it. Sorry. Simon Brown is coming to Yale this year to talk about architecture diagram. He has a great quote, which is, "You are making fundamental, serious architecture decisions every day, whether you're explicit about it or not." So you might not talk about it and think about it and go, "This is what we're going to do," but you're still making one. And so, yes, something to be mindful of. All yours.
Finally. No, I just had a quick tip. So if you are wanting, for smaller scale companies, if you want to monitor your users and what is actually happening on the client devices, there is a browser timing API available. Pretty much all the major browsers support this API with a single Lambda function and a DynamoDB backend. You can actually collect all that information and store it in S3 or Dynamo for immediate access, really, really cheap, and scale up to millions of requests per month. I've done it before, and it actually works surprisingly well. You can use something like Athena. Again, I'm sorry, I'm talking about AWS stuff, but I'm sure there's an Azure or GCP equivalent.
Probably don't want to use it.
Thanks. But yeah, there are ways of doing that very, very cheaply without having to spend an absolute monster on New Relic and things like that.
Yeah, I'd add we've been using Sentry, and they've been adding. We originally used it just for logging exceptions to get through to Slack and those sort of things, but they've added a lot, sort of moving into the budget APM sort of space, down to like slow queries, page rendering times, that sort of stuff. They're a lot pretty low price. So.
Just on that, what you just said, the like logging into Slack is a real trap. You're probably finding this, right? Because at some point you get a lot, and so you start ignoring it. And the minute you start ignoring it is when it bites you. Like, there were a lot of kind of slightly off readings with the O-rings on the space shuttle until the day it blew up. I know that just got dark real quick, didn't it? But it's like it's this kind of like broken window theory thing, right? Like you kind of ignore a couple of errors and then you ignore it's like, Slack's getting too noisy. What do you do then? You mute the channel.
That's what you lose.
That's what you do, and so that's where something like a PagerDuty is really good, or OpsGenie. You can kind of set those thresholds and go, we have seen, or Bugsnag will do it as well. It's like, we've seen a new error, and we've seen them a lot more than we normally do. Actually raise an alert, and then if you've got PagerDuty in the app, then there's an escalation path. So if Nathan ignores it, it goes to Tom, and if Tom ignores it, not that Nathan would ignore it. We know he's
He uses Arch, so he doesn't really have notifications. Regularly have to call him.
But you know what I mean? Like, once you start logging into Slack, and it's really easy, it's like, oh, everything plugs into Slack, and you can start to ignore it. So that's where something that actually goes, this is now an incident, and we need to respond to the incident, and and close it, starts to budge. That would be a tip, is if you start logging into Slack, don't do that, because at some point you ignore it. When you ignore it, it will bite you. It has already happened.
Just to add to that, I completely agree with what Damian just said. I generally tend to alert into OpsGenie or PagerDuty or whatever alerting tool you use, and then use Slack for like proactive notifications. So stuff that you need to be aware of, but not necessarily have to action straight away. I find it's a really good tool for that. But again, reiterating what was already said, if it's too spammy, if there's too many notifications, you need to do something. Like, don't just mute the channel. Deal with that problem up front. If there's too many notifications, it's just going to become an absolutely useless resource.
Or push daily summaries of like, we had this many errors or this many transactions, or daily summaries in Slack, because then people look and go, that's got up.
Absolutely.
Jeffrey?
One of the things that we do is kind of goes to the boundary between dev and ops, so that in our dashboards we have a vertical line that's nice deployment, because often in a system of steady state, a deployment would be a thing that triggers an error. To what degree in your structured logging approach are you including things like latest commit star, so that you can actually go, hey, I actually know which commit is causing, because it's all code in the database. So.
Yeah. So I tend to work a lot in .NET, so I'll stamp a build version into my assembly through something like Git version, semantic versioning, or someone to build them. So I'll have some build version stamped into my assembly, and I will, every log, the version and application name will be a property of that. So I can see that this version, you know, has a like higher average response time than that one. So you kind of see where you've introduced it.
And do you look at like factoring that into a whole flowbacks to
Always forward, never back.
Yes.
So now I have it. The other thing a lot of tools will let you do is, I think New Relic does this. I know Bugsnag does it. So Raygun will have an API to let you tell it when you are doing a deployment. So it'll go, you just deployed. I'm going to ease back a little bit on alerting you that, like, if you've got some warm up time or cache warm time or something like that. So you go, you've just deployed. I'm going to give you a little bit more threshold for a minute or two, and like let the system, rather than start alarming because you just deploying, you know, something got a bit slow.
Is that because of the JIT in .NET? Or?
Yeah, partly. But I mean, like lots of systems have some cache warm up time. Like you spin up a new instance and it's got to go and query a bunch of stuff and fill a Redis cache or your memory cache or whatever it is. So to just say, hey, we're doing a deployment now, things are getting a little bit funky, you know, and just kind of just back
we just take
the
that request for the entire runtime. So, yeah.
Lambda, baby.
It works. Yeah. So yeah, but what I was saying is like some monitoring tools will let you put in when there's a deployment. So it just kind of, yeah, you can tag it to go, there's going to be a shaking up period here.
And some will use that to attribute any future errors as being probably coming from that revision as well. We didn't see it before and it only came in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Probably start there.
Yeah. So Raygun, I know all of that will say these error appeared in this version.
Any more questions?
Not a question, but something that I'd add is like, so we have probably 1,000 time clocks connected to our system at any given moment, and they're running as an iPad app sort of thing. And I did not have any idea how flaky the internet was. Just generally, I just didn't know. And so you see all the Sentry errors was like, could not get a network connection and stuff like that. So there's all the observability that we have in the back end, which is all great, but you just have no idea how much stuff is going wrong before it even gets to a server sort of thing, which is a fascinating world, I think.
And visualizing that can be super interesting. So I saw a system where what people thought were there are just intermittent failures in the system and we don't know why. And so we actually started to log them out and go, well, like there's this intermittent failure that looks to be like a network timeout. So let's like run some stuff. We spin up some apps. We just like ping every 5 seconds and log it. And we saw failures and they looked, you know, in our logs like completely intermittent. We put them on a graph and what we saw was response times were creeping up. And when they hit a point, we'd see all the failures and then it'll drop down again and then go up. And what it was actually a piece of like network load balancer in the hosting data center was at 100% CPU. So what it was doing was just kind of slowly getting overloaded, slowing down. There was some leak in it. And then it would just go undone and it would drop everything for like 10, 20 seconds. Nothing would happen. And then it just dropped all its memory and then it was fine again for a while. And it wasn't until we took what we thought were random log errors and actually visualized them on a graph and overlaid them that we realized there's a pattern here and it all happens like things get slower, 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 everything crashes and then it's good again. And so taking that, I had no idea our internet was that flaky, and actually visualizing it can tell you so much sometimes.
That's really interesting.
It was like the day we looked at it, we went, wow, that's what's been going wrong all this time. So yeah, so like and again, back to observability, taking things like logging and be able to sort of pull properties out and graph them, you know, can tell a massive story.
I'd add to that, using Grafana with your CloudWatch then, and able to put
Exactly.
a couple of them together to be like,
it's like,
that
oh,
thing
at
goes up,
lunchtime,
that
all
thing
the
goes-
logs drop out, right?
or like when that thing goes up, that thing goes down, and be able to see them side by side, connect the dots in isolation can be often confusing. So
Yeah.
it's great. And then being able to just generally like change time using stuff is super valuable.
I think Andy has a question.
Yeah, so I guess we've spoken a lot about observability from a technical perspective. Damian mentioned a little bit about business and stuff. How do you rolling pictures out and things like that and evaluating features over time? What do you guys look at and doing around that sort of observability of an active feature? and end user usefulness of that feature, right? Not just observing it doesn't work, but does it actually generate business benefit for someone?
E-commerce platform. This is your warehouse, isn't it?
So I think there's two components to this. Something I'm very passionate about is what I call sort of decoupling deployment from release. I think that's a really important sort of distinction. A lot of businesses actually don't realize there's a difference. So feature flag and stuff like that. Yeah, look, I mean, it's sort of what I was saying before is that, you know, you've got all your infrastructure metrics, you've got all your infrastructure logging, but if you don't have a true view of the key business metrics around what you're trying to track. So what you're talking about is just good product management. It's basically predefining, you know, an initiative at an initiative level. You know, what does success look like? Like, what does adoption success look like, and what does the metric for that look like? So yeah, being very proactive around understanding, because too many, well, every software company builds something and then leaves it and then comes back and goes, well, it's had 1% adoption. We'll just leave it there, we'll move on. So, you know, they don't clean it up, they don't actually do any sort of housework, and then you end up with a platform like Nito sort of turned into in the end, because we would just rapidly build things as we needed. And we didn't go back and clean it up, and it turned into this huge monolith that, you know, that was really challenging to maintain. So yeah, so in short, I think it's just the nature of good product management. It's understanding what success looks like when you build something. So.
I'd say where that gets tricky though would be where the value isn't like just running a SQL query in your relational database of like how many this happened this month, and maybe what you're alluding to is some of the questions of like how fast did that thing actually happen? Like, can we actually build a payroll, like generate payroll in under some period of time, or those sort of things, which maybe aren't like a high level, something that you store in your relational database or something that's easy to quantify, but is comes down to more like your application performance or reliability, those sort of things. And sort of errs more on the technical side of a product management aspect rather than like how many people use this and those sort of things.
It can be useful to like measure things like conversion rates or like feature adoption and so on. And because we've seen things like conversion rates go up because you optimize availability. Up 30% increase in conversion because people weren't sitting there watching a beach ball bounce on the screen. That's, I'm not sure how you go about doing it, but there is kind of there's a nexus between, I think, observability, application monitoring, and product. And I don't know if anyone's actually doing that as a single sort of turnkey, single pane of glass approach, but being able to look at product analytics and going, so what not only are features working, but are things that we're actively doing to improve the platform, making existing features. Like,
And can you correlate them if they're in different systems? Right?
Yeah, that's.
Returning to the original question. I completely agree with Justin. It is a function of good product management, identifying metrics that are going to move the needle when you're coming up with a feature. But also to add to that, it's really important to give the developers tools, because the product managers aren't going to be the ones that actually create these metrics, that actually create dashboards that graph these metrics over time. So giving the developers the right tool to graph these things, to create these metrics, is super important as well. If you make it super easy, at the start of any given initiative, you can have those metrics in place already. You can even create a baseline, so if you've got a month's worth of metrics of, let's say you create a widget that increases revenue by X, right? You can graph revenue over time. You can then say, oh, okay, well, when we've released this, this feature using feature toggles, hopefully, you can see an actual change, and the work that's been done and the thousands of dollars that have been invested in development time has actually made an effect. Yeah.
I think we all love seeing a graph go like this, and then you do the thing and it goes, I like this and that. It's deeply satisfying. It's worth the engineering just for the graph.
As long as it goes the right way.
As long as it doesn't stay the same.
wrong way, you get the code.
Exactly.
It's also satisfying doing optimization work where you've got the metric and you've got the graph, and you do the release and you're like, your response time goes down and your CPU goes down. You're really like,
Particularly when it's just a feature flag, I know that you turn this thing on.
yeah.
Except when it goes to 0, then you
The disk is full.
Task failed successfully.
Andy?
I got one question. With the observing of the kind of like for the security levels, for example, for example, recently we heard a lot of news about Optus and then magnetic pairs. Like, is there any chance that we can use tools in that territory to detect those kind of fishy things as well? It's building our first line of defense lines.
Yeah, so we're pretty privileged in that we can use Cloudflare. So Cloudflare Analytics is the first place I go to when I think that something malicious might be happening. So it makes it really easy to see where the traffic's coming from, what user agent they're using, what IP range are they coming from, because generally speaking, malicious actors tend to use the same kind of hosting services, right? So Cloudflare I find is probably the most useful tool of all of them in terms of identifying and blocking malicious traffic. There's also a bunch of ways that you can sort of add observability around these kinds of things. You know, login attempts on EC2 instances. You can certainly graph that, and if there's an anomaly, you know, an increase in that number, then you know, send an alert to PagerDuty, wake you up, that kind of thing. Yeah, there is absolutely a number of ways that you can use these metrics to your advantage in order to proactively protect against malicious actors.
I've got some fun ones to add to that. So I've done a lot of work in sort of a compliance space around medical data, where again, to get sort of approval to go live, we had to go through a whole bunch of auditing and reviews and stuff. And so there's a sort of whole other sort of class of, I guess, observability tools that we've not talked around, called SIEMs, security, stand for anti-compliance, security incident event or whatever it is, something. Essentially, it's observability for security stuff, and the tools will sort of plug into stuff like failed EC2 attempts or infrastructure changes in Amazon or Azure. So plug those in, and then I've done some other stuff around logging audit actions as well. And again, I do a lot of messaging systems, so I sort of plug in somebody just hit this API, or we got an unauthorized attempt on this, because a lot of times it's not the external users that are coming in through Cloudflare, it's your internal users that you've got to be careful of. In security, like a lot of security incidents happen from inside. Like I saw this morning that Facebook just found out that they had a bunch of staff and contractors that were taking bribes to take over somebody's account. So you go bribe some of the work better to, you know, hack your ex's account and stalk them or whatever. Like capturing unauthorized or unusual internal activity and logging that. So what I've done is taken again in a messaging sort of pub subsystem, publish those sort of audit events, capture them in a database away from all of the other sort of system data, and then push them into the SIEM as well. So that then, because what those SIEMs do, will run sort of queries over there and look for anomalies. You know, look, it's usually in this steady state, but on this date, you know, a whole bunch of weird activity happened that was out of the ordinary, raised a security incident for somebody to go and have a look at. The other thing I've done at an infrastructure side is plug that into, in this case, it was Azure, but all of our infrastructure for our application was managed through Terraform and Terraform Cloud. So if you pay Terraform Cloud enough money, they'll give you an API to pull all the audit data in. So we could say, okay, if something changed in Azure, so something, you know, infrastructure changed, but there wasn't a correlating action in the Terraform Cloud API, that's an anomaly, because like it was kind of drift management by going, somebody changed our infrastructure, and we can find out who, and it wasn't through our normal sort of code review Terraform Cloud way. So a lot of the same concepts, just slightly different tooling.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. And you know, the Optus example is a great example where maybe a lot of this tool wouldn't have picked it up, because essentially if you connect staging to production,
The SIEM should have got that. Like, why did
this is true. This is true. So I think the education and awareness piece is so critical as well. Like you should bake security into everything you do, you know, from day one. So that's around, you know, educating developers on, you know, secure coding standards, security awareness, all that kind of stuff, because the weakest link often is actually the person or technologies.
I think, without prejudicing any sort of future court action that may come. I think
We're
that was
recording.
what meant. Yeah, thank you. I think that's what Medicare ended up being in the end was like a social engineering thing, as was like Sony and Rockstar and like Microsoft and like
Yeah.
heaps. All of them, like literally all of them.
People are the worst.
80% is the number, like the amount of breaches that are caused by human error, not some hacker in a basement. Yeah.
Sort of a kind of a question on that last bit. I'm just thinking of the scenario when you've got an inside job, someone who's potentially downloading loads of client information because they have export privileges, so CSVs and all kinds of bulk data. The project one of the projects I'm involved in, we log all, like anyone who's got export privileges, we log every time they dare to do that. How do you know how often to check for anomalies? Like, how do you know? I mean, are you checking daily for a spike, or is that too late? Like, how do
So-
you know where to draw the line on
Yeah, so
identifying
this
an
is,
anomaly?
this is where your scene comes in. So again, the tooling helps you aggregate this stuff, and there are, there's usually good, there's good thresholding in that tooling that will give you an idea of, what you're after. So, when, I've done ISO 27001, and I've also done PCI DSS, and, the centerpiece of that is all the event collation in the middle, and that's the tooling really helps you to do that. But it's actually quite a heavy load and quite a heavy job. Like you've got to have
Experts to do
you've
it.
got to have experts to do it. Like it's not something that just happens. You can't just put PagerDuty on your scene and go, ta-da, we're fixed.
Compliant.
So so the question, the statement is it's actually very hard. It's actually very hard to do it well, and you do need dedicated people who actually know what to do.
And you'll tune it out over time too. So if you've got people that, yes, they're meant to download 5 sets of CSVs a day and they do it after lunch, then like the first time that happens might be like, what are you doing? So, okay, that's a normal pattern. It doesn't help the fact that somebody that like builds that into their normal pattern then does a malicious one.
Exactly. Yeah.
At least in the ones I've seen, they cut 2 or 3 now. One, they did it outside business hours, so the scene would have picked it up. We didn't pick it up at the time. We had one would have picked up because it was like 9 o'clock at night. They were doing actions in an office.
From Russia.
Right. So the activity is normal, but the timing of the
activity was normal,
activity
but the timing was
suspicious.
wrong.
Or the IP address or the VPN or, all of those factors.
Well, I think the scariest thing is if you've got somebody who works for you
Hmm.
and then they're disgruntled and then they want to go somewhere else and they take your client role with them.
Yeah.
And
So then
that's
you would see
nasty.
it would be more because they're not going to be doing the 2 or 3 they need. I'm going to bulk down by everything. And
Yeah.
that's
That's where like the Optus one, and I think there's another one or 2 that I've seen that has definitely been picked up by a scene because the API calls to download was not one API call, it was thousands,
enumerated.
hundreds
Yeah.
of thousands of API calls. Company that I used to work for got not hacked, but got attacked towards.
Would you say bends over?
There is a code of conduct here.
But it was found following unstructured logging and making sure when our logging from the outside was doing exactly the same things that Typo does, with logging the IP and logging the host names and things like that. And then doing what the Damian's one, we graphed the metrics from what was happening, and it was like, why at 6 a.m. is someone doing this when we were a business that served Australians? And it was like,
Wasn't a hack, it was distributed backup.
it was scalping, but yeah.
Yeah, so it was a scary moment in time. It was before I worked for this company, and then after that internal abuse, that attack, then they started logging everything that anyone ever did, and so it sucks to have to wait for the abuse to happen before you start logging. So just log.
Yeah, so I guess if you're building that sort of system, put it in early, like bring in a scene early and have the tolerance thresholds low. And yes, it's going to be irritating for a little while. Like if you're in that sort of,
patterns. Yeah.
if you're in that environment where it matters. So you like your PCI DSS or healthcare somewhere where they comply, like there's a penalty to it going bad, right? Which is coming for all of us, right? There's good, like the penalties for it going bad are going to become the default. So it's good that we're talking about this stuff now. So if you set the thresholds really low to establish what is normal behavior, than somebody downloading the whole client database at 9 o'clock at night from a Russian IP address to the VPN. That's going to get found out because it's going to breach that threshold.
Makes sense. Get a big round of applause for our panelists.
We have a little token of appreciation for our panelists here as well.
3 elephants.
And little gifts from AWS, although I don't think they branded the water bottles they sent me, so you get an unbranded water bottle. This is probably better. But without dropping it everywhere. Water bottles for everyone, and we have an AWS t-shirt as well. I don't know what size you guys are.
Medium.
Large,
I'll take
medium,
that one.
and small. You want the large? You want the medium?
I'll take this one.
I have other mediums if you prefer a medium.
Oh, me.
If it's not big enough, just sign up to Nathan's shredding program.
So this is the last one, obviously, for us this year. As we mentioned, there's tech drinks on the 15th in the Valley. Everyone is welcome, RSVP on the meetup, but it's a combined one with all sorts of other meetups as well. So lots of people to come and meet. Otherwise, keep your eyes peeled for next year's one. Maybe we'll get 4 next year. Maybe we won't. We'll see. But yeah, if you have any talk ideas, please jump on the GitHub, the meetups page, and propose anything. If you've got any talks you would like to see as well, also welcome. I think there was something to do with pizza prices.
There was. I'm pretty sure. Well, I checked before the panel, and only 2 people had submitted. So maybe you guys get multiple. Yeah, we have Sam and Rudy. That's the only people who submitted for pizza. So I guess you guys win multiple vouchers each. Congratulations.
I never said there was going to be a draw at the end. I thought there was something like longer term that we have to do after.
Longer term.
I don't know. I didn't know if there's
Like you have 48 hours to enter or something.
I have no idea what it was before you said
No.
so.
Well, if you
The
guys
Q1 next
if
year.
you guys are quick in the next 5 minutes, BrisPHP.com/pizza. It's like, no, it's my pizza. Steal a voucher off Sam or Rudy.
Excellent. And a big round of applause on foundU and CreditSense for sponsoring tonight.
Thanks, Dominic.
Thank you.